I was seated third from the end of the table, hands folded, back straight against the chair. The room smelled faintly of toner and coffee that had gone cold. The glass wall behind the attorney reflected us all back in clean, distorted lines. He didn't lower his voice. "She doesn't need to be here," my husband said, smiling as if he were being generous. "This is financial, I handle it." The attorney paused with a pen hovering above the page. Two associates looked up. Someone across the table shifted in their seat. No one interrupted him. I didn't move. He leaned back, crossing his arms, comfortable in the attention. "We're restructuring," he continued. "Some temporary pressure." She wouldn't understand the numbers anyway. A few people laughed, not loudly, the polite kind, the kind that lands and then disappears. I kept my eyes on the legal pad in front of me. The paper was blank except for the date printed in the corner. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Calder, your wife is listed on," he waved it off, "as a spouse, not a decision maker." Then he looked directly at me. "No offense." I nodded once, neutral, accepting. "The way you acknowledge whether," he went on, louder now, filling the space. "She's brilliant at other things, just not this. I've always said some people aren't wired for money." Silence followed. The kind that presses inward instead of out. I waited. The attorney finally spoke. "We do need all parties present given the notices that were delivered this morning." That got his attention. "Notices?" he said, sitting forward again. "What notices?" No one answered immediately. Pages were adjusted. A folder was opened. The sound of paper moving felt amplified in the quiet room. I watched his reflection in the glass. The confidence was still there, but it had shifted. Tightened around the eyes. He glanced at me again, sharper this time, as if checking whether I had missed something important. I hadn't. One of the associates slid an envelope across the table toward him. Cream-colored, thick, official. He picked it up, frowned, then laughed once. "This is nothing," he said. "We'll clear it." I said nothing. The attorney looked at me briefly, then back to him. "We'll need a moment before proceeding," she said carefully. Another pause settled over the room. I remained exactly where I was, hands still folded, breathing even. Whatever he thought he was taking from me in that moment, status, voice, relevance, he did it in front of witnesses. That mattered. The room stayed quiet long enough for the sound of the air conditioner to register. Then the meeting resumed. "My name is Alina Calder. I was 38 at the time, and I had already built a life that functioned without improvisation. I lived in a 4-bedroom house on the north side of the city, 10 minutes from my office, close enough that I walked when the weather allowed. I worked in operations management for a regional logistics firm, not a glamorous title. A stable one. My job was to make systems behave the way they were designed to and to notice when they didn't. I'd been doing it for over a decade. Deadlines were met. Budgets closed. Mistakes were documented and corrected before they became expensive. Money to me had never been emotional. It was arithmetic and timing, income streams, fixed costs, risk margins. I kept my personal accounts boring on purpose. High credit score, no surprises. Our marriage had followed a similar pattern at first. 2 adults, shared responsibilities, clean division of labor. We lived in a mid-sized city where stability still counted for something, and we had been careful about appearances because carelessness always shows eventually. By the time of that meeting, I had been married for 11 years. We had no children. We had no shared business ventures. We had an agreement, spoken, then later written, that large financial decisions would be discussed before they were made. I honored that agreement. When I say that, I'm not asking for credit. I'm establishing baseline behavior. The attorney that morning didn't ask why I was quiet. She didn't need to. Competence recognizes itself. I was there because my name was on the file, because it belonged there. I had not come to argue, explain, or correct anyone. I had come to observe, confirm, and wait. The imbalance in our marriage didn't begin with money. It showed up in smaller, easier places first. Decisions that were made quickly, assumptions that didn't require my input, a steady drift from partnership into something more hierarchical. I adjusted early. When his work hours became unpredictable, I absorbed the logistics. Bills, scheduling, insurance renewals. When his income fluctuated, I stabilized hours by keeping my role steady and our expenses conservative. None of this was framed as sacrifice at the time. It was responsibility. Someone had to hold the line. He framed his financial control as confidence. He spoke in generalities: growth, leverage, opportunity, while I handled the specifics he found tedious. The mortgage statements, the tax filings, the documentation that turns plans into obligations. Over time, the division hardened. He talked, I executed. At his request, I stepped back from any visible involvement in long-term planning. It's cleaner if one person handles it, he said once dismissively. I agreed because clarity matters, and because I had learned that argument wasn't the point. What mattered was fairness. We had an agreement. It wasn't romantic, but it was clear. Large risks would be disclosed. Shared exposure would be discussed. Nothing would be hidden that could materially affect the other person's future. That agreement was violated quietly, repeatedly, and with intent. I didn't discover the breach all at once. It arrived in fragments, odd delays, accounts he discouraged me from reviewing, explanations that changed depending on who was asking. Each instance, taken alone, was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. I noted it. I didn't confront it. There is a difference between trust and blindness. I had no interest in the latter. By the time his contempt became casual comments about my lack of financial instinct, jokes made in front of friends, I understood the role I'd been assigned. Passive, decorative, uninformed, I accepted that role publicly. Privately, I kept track of what was being asked of me and what was being taken without consent. This wasn't about wounded pride or emotional injury. It was about obligation and exposure. About one person making decisions that bound another without disclosure. Fairness isn't complicated. If risk is shared, authority must be shared as well. That standard had already been abandoned. Once I started paying attention, the pattern didn't require interpretation. It repeated with the consistency of habit. He borrowed confidence the way some people borrow money, casually, publicly, always assuming it would be replenished. Conversations about finances became performances delivered for effect rather than clarity. He liked rooms where he could talk uninterrupted. He avoided paperwork that asked follow-up questions. I handled those. Loan summaries arrived addressed to him, but I opened the shared mail as we'd always done. I didn't confront him when I saw unfamiliar account names. I copied them down. When statements went paperless without discussion, I noted the timing. When he suggested moving our savings to simplify things, I asked which institution. He gave me a name once, a different one the next time. I didn't comment on the inconsistency, I wrote it down. There were years when his income spiked sharply. Consulting work, short-term partnerships, cash-heavy months followed by quiet stretches. During those periods, he spoke expansively about future positioning. Bigger returns, temporary leverage. I asked procedural questions. Interest rates, maturity dates, collateral. He laughed those off. You worry too much, he said. That's not how money works at this level. I let the statement sit. It told me more than he realized. The belittling became part of the structure, never explosive, always casual. He'd correct me in front of people even when I was right. He'd summarize my comments as if translating them for the room. If I challenged him, he'd soften his voice and explain that he was just being realistic. I learned not to challenge him publicly. That wasn't retreat, it was positioning. At home, I kept a small filing box in the bottom drawer of my desk. Nothing dramatic: deeds, insurance riders, credit reports pulled annually, then quarterly. I checked my name against liabilities. I separated what was joint from what was implied. When I didn't like the answers, I adjusted future decisions. The house was the first. When we bought it, he wanted speed, a competitive offer. Minimal review. I slowed the process, citing work travel. In the end, the title went into my name alone. It made sense at the time, I said. My credit was cleaner, the rate was better. He agreed without much thought. He was focused elsewhere. Later came the accounts. I maintained my own checking and savings as I always had. When he suggested consolidation, I delayed. When delay wasn't an option, I set limits. Visibility without authority. I never touched his accounts. I didn't need to. The silence between discoveries grew longer. Weeks, then months. That was deliberate. Silence gives people room to reveal themselves further, and he did. There were missed payments he blamed on clerical errors. A tax estimate he postponed. A line of credit he referred to vaguely as if naming it precisely would give it weight. Each explanation came easily. Too easily. I watched him explain things to other people the same way, confident. Imprecise, always forward-facing. By the time he began making jokes about my talent for organization as if it were a quaint hobby, I understood the full shape of the arrangement. He believed I was managing around him, not against the exposure he was creating. He mistook my restraint for ignorance. That misunderstanding was useful. I didn't warn him, I didn't correct him, I didn't prepare him. I prepared myself. Every document I retained had a purpose. Every delay bought time. Every moment I chose not to speak preserved leverage. There was nothing emotional about it. This wasn't patience born of hope. It was patience born of clarity. Systems fail slowly, then all at once. I was simply making sure I wasn't standing underneath when his did. By the time his financial pressure reached the surface, the structure was already in place. Nothing I did was reactive. It didn't need to be. The house mattered most because it anchored everything else. Mortgage, insurance, tax exposure. When the title was recorded solely in my name, it wasn't a maneuver. It was a risk assessment. My credit profile lowered the rate by nearly a full point. That decision saved us over $60,000 across the life of the loan. No one objected. Least of all him. I never refinanced jointly. When rates dropped again years later, I handled it the same way. Same lender, same name on the deed. He signed what was required and ignored what wasn't. Accounts followed a similar logic. I kept my income rooted through institutions he had no access to. Not secret, just separate. Transparency doesn't require shared control. It requires clarity, and he never asked for that. What I did do was document boundaries. Every time I was asked to co-sign, I declined politely. It doesn't make sense with my role, I'd say, or let's revisit it next quarter. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It delays. When he opened lines of credit without disclosure, the absence of my name was conspicuous. It insulated me legally and financially. That wasn't luck, it was consistency. I didn't confront him because confrontation wasn't useful. Exposure was. I consulted professionals without drama, one meeting at a time. A property attorney to confirm ownership protections. A financial advisor to stress test scenarios I hoped wouldn't materialize. An accountant to verify how liability would fall if obligations were missed. Each conversation ended the same way. I was protected as long as I didn't blur lines that were already clean, so I didn't. The lever wasn't hidden because it was clever. It was hidden because no one was looking for it. He assumed control because he spoke confidently. He assumed ignorance because I didn't challenge him. Institutions don't operate on assumptions. They operate on paperwork. When the first delinquency notice was issued, it wasn't addressed to me. When the second arrived, it still wasn't. That was the confirmation I needed. Everything he'd taken on lived squarely in his name. I waited. Waiting isn't passive when it's deliberate. It's a form of restraint that preserves options. I continued paying the mortgage on time. I continued funding my retirement. I didn't change my routine. Stability is disarming. By the time debt collectors began escalating, the legal picture was already frozen. There was nothing left to rearrange, no signatures to obtain, no assets to shift without triggering scrutiny. The system was simply doing what it always does when information finally catches up with behavior. I hadn't set a trap. I had refused to stand in the wrong place. When the meeting was scheduled, lawyers present, notices printed, accounts reviewed, I knew exactly what would be discussed. I also knew what wouldn't. My role was never to expose him. It was to remain outside the blast radius when his decisions finally became visible. The second meeting took place in the same building on a higher floor, different room, thicker table. The kind of space designed to slow people down. I arrived 5 minutes early. He arrived 10 minutes late. When he walked in, his confidence was already strained. He smiled too quickly, shook hands too firmly, spoke before anyone asked him to. I watched him scan the room, recalibrating. 2 attorneys, a representative from the bank, a junior associate with a laptop already open. I waited for everyone to sit before I did. "We can move quickly," he said, settling into his chair. "There's been some confusion." No one responded immediately. The bank representative slid a folder toward the center of the table. Dark blue, embossed seal. He didn't open it. "We're here to clarify exposure," she said, neutral, measured. "And to document next steps." My husband laughed under his breath. "That won't take long." Silence followed, long enough for him to look around expectantly. No one met his eyes. The attorney on my left finally spoke. Before we proceed, we need to confirm ownership and liability. She turned slightly toward me. Mrs. Calder, can you confirm your relationship to the property in question? I didn't answer right away. I adjusted the pen in front of me, aligning it with the edge of the notepad. The movement was small. It gave the room time to settle. Yes, I said, I can. He frowned. What does that mean? The attorney kept her eyes on me. Please, I am the sole owner of the house, I said, one sentence. Flat, accurate. He laughed again, louder this time. That's not what this is about. The bank representative opened the folder. She slid a copy of the deed across the table. Then the mortgage statement. Then the insurance rider, each document placed carefully as if order itself mattered. The property is not listed as collateral on any outstanding obligations, she said. Nor are Mrs. Calder's accounts. He leaned forward, scanning the pages. That's not right, he said. We're married. Silence. Marriage doesn't overwrite documentation. No one said it. They didn't need to. You can't just. His voice rose. Why wouldn't you tell me? I looked at him then, just long enough. You said I wasn't smart enough to handle money, I said. The words landed cleanly. No edge, no volume. They didn't need either. He turned toward me fully now. This is ridiculous, he said. You knew this was temporary. You knew I was fixing it. No one intervened as he spoke. His voice filled the space, then started to fracture. Questions layered over accusations. Timing, intent, blame. The attorney let him finish. Mr. Calder, she said when he ran out of breath, your liabilities are personal. The institutions involved have already initiated proceedings. He shook his head. She's my wife. The bank representative closed the folder. She is not your guarantor. For a brief moment, something sharp passed through me, not anger, recognition. I felt it, acknowledged it, and let it go. I honored every agreement we made, I said, including the ones you stopped honoring. That was the most I allowed myself. The room stayed quiet, not tense, conclusive. He sat back slowly as if the chair had shifted beneath him. His hands moved to the edge of the table, then stopped. He didn't speak again. The meeting ended shortly after. Signatures were collected, timelines outlined, consequences explained without emphasis. As we stood to leave, the attorney nodded at me once. Professional, respectful. I returned the nod. Outside, the hallway was empty. The doors closed softly behind us, sealing the discussion inside. What followed was no longer a conversation. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It arrived in stages spaced out by procedure and delay. Within 3 weeks, his consulting income froze, not seized, paused. Clients don't like uncertainty, and word travels quickly when invoices stop clearing. He spent his mornings on the phone, voice low, door closed. By the end of the month, the calls grew shorter, then they stopped. Formal notices followed. Default timelines, requests for documentation he no longer had access to. Each letter carried the same tone, neutral, patient, unmoved by explanation. Institutions are polite that way. He tried to refinance. He couldn't. Without assets to secure against, the numbers didn't justify the risk. He appealed. He blamed clerical errors. He asked for extensions that were technically possible and practically irrelevant. Credit does not respond to confidence. It responds to history. Friends noticed before he told them. Dinners were postponed, plans delayed. He started explaining things in advance, the way people do when they expect questions. Some nodded, some stopped asking. He moved out quietly, not in anger, in logistics. A few boxes at a time. He left behind furniture he didn't have space for, books he no longer read, files that were no longer useful. I didn't supervise, I didn't interfere. Legal proceedings advanced without urgency. Deadlines passed. Options narrowed. Every attempt to involve me ended the same way. My name wasn't attached. There was nothing to contest. Months later, the house was still calm. Payments cleared. Utilities stayed on. The routines I'd built didn't change. Stability is noticeable when chaos is nearby. We spoke twice during that period. Both conversations were brief, practical. He asked questions I had already answered through documentation. I repeated myself once. After that, I stopped. Isolation followed naturally. It usually does. People distance themselves from collapse not out of cruelty but instinct. His social circle thinned. His voice, once so certain, softened when he spoke to others. I didn't track his losses. I tracked my obligations. Property taxes paid in April. Insurance renewed in June. Retirement contributions automated in July. Justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just keeps going. By the end of the year, his name no longer surfaced in my daily life. No alerts, no shared accounts. No unresolved ties. What remained was quiet, ordered, unremarkable, and that was the point. Time has a way of simplifying things, not by softening them but by removing what no longer holds. A year after the meeting, I reviewed my files and closed what was finished. Old folders, expired documents, agreements that had run their course. I didn't keep souvenirs, I kept records until they stopped being necessary. People asked questions occasionally, not directly, the careful kind. I answered them the same way each time, calm, accurate, brief. There was nothing to clarify. The situation had resolved itself through the systems we all rely on. I didn't take satisfaction in his losses. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was fairness. Shared risk requires shared authority. When that balance is ignored, consequences follow whether anyone wants them to or not. I stayed in the house. Not because it represented victory, but because it was stable. I refinished the study where I kept my files, replaced the desk that had always been temporary, and donated what no longer fit my life. The space became functional again. I made one change that year. I set up a small scholarship through my company's community program. Nothing public, modest funding. It supported continuing education in operations and finance, practical skills that keep people from being told they're not wired for understanding how systems work. Control doesn't require dominance, it requires boundaries. Looking back, there was never a moment where I decided to win. I decided not to lose what I had earned to someone else's secrecy. Everything that followed came from that choice. He once believed my silence meant ignorance. He believed my composure meant compliance. Those assumptions cost him more than any argument ever could have. I didn't destroy him. I stepped aside and let the structure he built collapse on its own. When I lock the door at night, the house is quiet, solid, paid for. It stands because it was built carefully and because I refused to pretend that carelessness was strength. That was the difference between us.